The door slammed so hard the window shook. 1 second, an old man was standing in a doorway, rain dripping from his gray hair, his hands trembling, his eyes searching his daughter's face for something, anything, that told him she didn't mean it. The next second there was nothing but a closed door, cold wood, and the sound of the storm swallowing him whole. He stood there for a long moment. Just stood there. His lips moved slightly, like he was rehearsing something to say. But there was no one left to hear it. He turned, slowly, and walked into the rain. This is the story of Arthur Mercer, a man who gave everything he had to one person, and the night that person gave it all back. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And if you're new here, click the subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Arthur Mercer was 64 years old, and he looked every single one of us those years. His hands were rough and calloused, not from laziness but from decades of work, factory floors, construction sites, night shifts, weekend overtime. His back had a slight stoop that hadn't always been there, a physical record of years spent bending, lifting, carrying. His hair had gone fully silver by his 55th birthday. He didn't mind. He said silver was the color of something that had lasted. He had a quiet kind of dignity about him. Not the showy kind, not the kind that demanded rooms fall silent when he walked in. Just the quiet kind. The kind that shows up every single day without being asked. The kind that's so steady you barely notice it until the day it's gone. Arthur had been a father for 31 years. His daughter, Claire, was born on a Tuesday morning in late March, and from the moment the nurse placed her in his arms, Arthur Mercer became a different kind of man. His wife, Ruth, used to joke that Claire had her father's stubbornness and her mother's heart. She said it with pride. She said a lot of things with pride back then. But Ruth got sick when Claire was 9. Really sick. The kind of sick that doesn't politely announce itself and then leave. It stayed. It took its time. And by the time Claire was 12, it had taken Ruth entirely. Arthur grieved. Of course he grieved, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. He had a 12-year-old daughter sitting across the breakfast table every morning, watching him with enormous, uncertain eyes, waiting to see whether the world was going to hold together or fall apart. He made sure it held together. He worked double shifts when the bills stacked up. He learned to braid hair from a YouTube video when Claire started middle school and didn't want to go in looking like she didn't have a mother. He sat through every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every recital Claire ever had. He bought a secondhand book on teenage psychology and read the whole thing, cover to cover, dog-earing the pages he wanted to come back to. He wasn't perfect. He burnt dinner more times than he could count. He said the wrong thing plenty. He worked so much that sometimes weeks slipped by before he realized he hadn't just sat with her, just talked. But he always came back to her. He always found his way back. Claire grew up bright and warm and fiercely independent. She had her mother's laugh, loud and unguarded in a way that always caught people off guard, and her father's quiet persistence. She was the kind of person people gravitated toward without quite knowing why. She had a way of making whoever she was talking to feel like the most interesting person in the room. For most of her 20s, she and her father spoke every week. Long phone calls, the kind where you say goodbye 3 times before you actually hang up. She visited on holidays and sometimes just because. They had routines. Sunday morning calls, birthday dinners at the same, Italian restaurant they'd been going to since she was 16, the annual tradition of watching old films together on New Year's Eve. Then she met Daniel Holt, and everything, very slowly, began to change. Daniel was exactly the kind of man who made a first impression that was difficult to forget. He was tall and well-dressed in the effortless way that speaks of money spent without appearing to be. He had dark, attentive eyes and a smile that arrived at exactly the right moment, like he had a sixth sense for when to deploy it. He was charming in a way that felt personal, like his charm was made specifically for you, tailored to fit. Claire met him at a work function, and by her own account, she didn't stand a chance. She called her father the morning after their first date, still half breathless with it. "Dad," she said, "I think I just met someone." Arthur laughed. That warm, slightly cautious laugh of a parent who is genuinely happy but also quietly paying attention. "Tell me about him," he said. She told him everything. Daniel was a property developer. He was 41 to her 31. He was confident and funny, and he had actually listened, to every word she said all evening. He had texted her before she even got home. Arthur listened. He asked a few gentle questions. At the end, he said, "As long as he makes you happy, sweetheart." He meant it. He also meant the caution hiding inside it, the careful note of wait and see. But Claire heard the happiness part and ran with it. The Sunday morning calls became less frequent. At first, it was understandable. She was in that early, dizzy stretch of a new relationship where the whole world shrinks to the size of one person. Arthur understood. He'd been there once, a very long time ago. But the calls didn't pick back up the way he expected. And when they did speak, there was something different in her voice. A slight distance, like she was speaking from the other side of a pane of glass. He tried not to read too much into it. He met Daniel for the first time at a dinner Claire hosted at her apartment about 4 months into their relationship. He arrived with flowers for Claire and a firm handshake for Arthur, and a confidence so smooth it almost felt rehearsed. Over dinner, Daniel talked more than anyone else at the table. He had opinions on everything and delivered them in the tone of someone who was used to having their opinions treated as facts. Arthur was polite. He was always polite. He asked questions, listened to the answers, kept his face carefully neutral. On the drive home, his hands sat at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, and he thought about the way Daniel had spoken over Claire twice during dinner without seeming to notice. He thought about the way Claire had glanced at Daniel before answering Arthur's questions. Not for permission, exactly, but something in that direction. Something adjacent to it. He told himself he was being a protective father. He told himself he was projecting. He told himself to give the man a chance. He gave him a chance. 6 months later, Claire called to say they were moving in together. 9 months after that, she called to say they were engaged. Arthur bought a new suit for the engagement party. He smiled through the whole evening. He said all the right things. He meant some of them, because by then, he had started to notice other things. The Italian restaurant tradition had quietly disappeared. Daniel didn't like Italian food. The New Year's Eve film nights had ended. Daniel spent New Year's with his own circle of friends, and naturally Claire went with him. The Sunday calls had reduced to a brief check-in every other week, sometimes less. When Arthur mentioned he had been feeling unwell, a persistent tiredness, some chest tightness, Claire's response had been warm but brief. "Make sure you see the doctor, Dad." She moved on quickly. He noticed she didn't call back to follow up. That wasn't the Claire he had raised. That wasn't the girl who had once driven 3 hours in a snowstorm because he'd mentioned offhandedly that he had a bad cold. Something was changing her. Slowly, steadily, like water reshaping stone. And Arthur, with his quiet dignity and his calloused hands and his deep, patient love for his daughter, could feel it happening and didn't know how to stop it. He tried once to say something. It was a Sunday afternoon. one of their increasingly rare calls. He had asked gently how things were going, whether she was happy, whether Daniel treated her well. There had been a pause. Then Claire's voice came back, a little cooler than before. "Dad, I'm fine. Why do you always ask it like something's wrong?" "I don't mean it like that. I know what you mean. Daniel says you've never really given him a fair shot. And honestly, he's not wrong." Arthur said nothing, for a moment. "I'm going to go," Claire said. "I'll call you next week." She called 3 weeks later. Arthur started going to the Tuesday evening community dinners at his local church, not because he was particularly religious, but because the alternative was sitting in a house that had been quietly accumulating silence since his daughter started pulling away. He volunteered at the library on Saturday mornings. He took up walking, long, slow loops around the park near his house in all weather, because motion helped. He kept himself occupied. He kept himself dignified. He kept waiting for the tide to turn. It was Daniel who finally found the opening he'd been looking for. The catalyst was small, as these things usually are. A visit to the couple's home, a large, well-appointed house that Daniel had purchased before their relationship and that Claire now shared, during which Arthur had made an innocent comment about the kitchen layout. Something like, "It's quite open plan, isn't it? Your mother always preferred something more contained. She said kitchens were for cooking in, not showing off." He hadn't meant it as an insult. He had meant it as nostalgia, as Ruth, as the particular kind of grief that surfaces without warning when something in the present reminds you of the past. But Daniel had heard it differently. Or perhaps he had heard it perfectly well and simply chosen to use it. That evening, after Arthur had gone, Daniel sat across from Claire at the kitchen island she had reportedly showed off and spoke quietly, precisely in that way of his. "He does it every time, every single visit. He finds something to criticize. Your choices, your home, us." Claire frowned. "He was just talking about Mom." "Was he?" Because from where I was standing, he was comparing our home to the kind of home your mother ran, which is a roundabout way of saying he doesn't think you've made good decisions. I'm not angry. I'm just telling you what I see. He's never going to accept this life you've built, Claire. Some people don't move on. They stay stuck in the past, and they want to keep you stuck there with them." He said it gently. He always said things gently. That was part of what made it so effective. The seed was small. It didn't need to be large. It just needed to land in the right soil. And Daniel was very good at finding the right soil. Over the following weeks, it grew. Daniel found new occasions to introduce new grievances. He mentioned, casually, almost as an afterthought, that Arthur had once questioned their financial decisions. He brought up a comment Arthur had made years ago about Daniel's industry. He constructed, with great patience and architectural precision, a version of Arthur Mercer that Claire had never quite seen before. A man who was negative, who was holding her back, who was quietly poisoning her happiness with his inability to let go of the past. And Claire, who was tired and stressed and so deeply embedded in the life Daniel had built around her that she had stopped seeing it as a construction, started to believe it. The arguments between Claire and her father became more frequent. They were never explosive. Arthur was not an explosive man, but they were sharp in the way that small, precise cuts are sharp. Disagreements about nothing that were really about everything. Calls that ended abruptly. Visits that were canceled. Then came the chest pain. Arthur had been having episodes for a while. He'd seen the doctor twice, had some tests, been told to watch his stress levels and cut back on salt and come back in 6 weeks. He hadn't told Claire about the second set of tests. He hadn't wanted to worry her. But the episodes were getting worse, and one night, at the beginning of December, in the middle of a night so cold it had frozen the locks on his car, he made a decision. He called Claire. He called. "I think I need some help," he said. "Just for a little while? Just until I know what the tests say." There was a long pause. "Dad, I'm not asking to stay forever. Just a few weeks. I wouldn't ask if... Let me talk to Daniel." He arrived 3 days later with one suitcase and the quiet, careful movements of a man who knew he was a guest in a place that had not exactly invited him. Daniel was courteous, professionally courteous. The kind of courtesy that is a performance rather than a feeling. Perfectly executed and entirely cold underneath. He showed Arthur to the guest room, offered him a drink, and excused himself to take a work call. Claire smiled too much. That was the thing Arthur noticed. She smiled the way people smile when they're trying very hard to make a room feel less tense than it is. He should have left. He knew it. Part of him knew it the moment he crossed the threshold, but he was tired, and his chest hurt, and he was 64, years old, and he had raised this woman from a 12-year-old child, watching him across a breakfast table with enormous, uncertain eyes, and he just needed somewhere to rest. He didn't get to rest. The atmosphere in the house was wrong from the first morning. Not obviously wrong. Nothing was said openly. Nothing was confronted. But there was a temperature to it. The kind of cold that has nothing to do with central heating. Daniel barely spoke to Arthur directly. When he did, it was in the tone of a man tolerating something he had agreed to but not endorsed. He spoke to Claire in lowered voices in rooms Arthur wasn't in. He came home from work and went straight upstairs without acknowledging that the house had another person in it. Claire oscillated. Some mornings she was warm, making coffee, sitting at the table, asking Arthur how he was sleeping. Other times she was distant and distracted, her eyes going to the stairs every few minutes like she was waiting for a signal. On the fourth day, the signal came. Arthur was sitting in the living room in the early evening, reading, when he heard raised voices from upstairs. He couldn't make out words, just tones. Daniel's voice, low and controlled. Claire's, higher, more uncertain. Then footsteps on the stairs. Then Claire appeared in the doorway. She was pale. Her jaw was set in that particular way it always set when she was trying not to feel something. "Dad." Her voice was careful, measured, like she was reading from a script she hadn't had enough time to memorize. "We need to talk." Arthur put his book down. He looked at his daughter's face, the face he had memorized over 31 years, every expression and inflection of it, and he already knew what was coming. He had known it was coming since the moment he arrived. "Daniel thinks... we both think..." She stopped, started again. "This isn't working. Having you here, it's creating tension, and we have enough going on, and I just think it would be better if I left. Dad, it's all right. I'll get my things. You don't have to go tonight. I didn't mean tonight." But Daniel appeared behind her then. He had his hands in his pockets, and his face was composed and civil in the way a polished surface is civil. Smooth and reflective and revealing nothing. "Actually," Daniel said quietly, "I think tonight would be better. For everyone." The word hung in the air. Claire said nothing. Arthur looked at his daughter for a long moment. He looked at her the way a man looks at something he is trying to commit to memory, because some part of him understands, maybe for the first time, fully understands, that things are not going to be the same after this. Then he nodded. He stood up. He went upstairs, packed his single suitcase in 12 minutes, came back down, and stopped at the front door. "Claire." She was standing in the hallway, arms crossed over her, chest not quite meeting his eyes. "Whatever's going on," Arthur said quietly, "I am your father. I will always be your father. And I am not the person who is hurting you." Silence. He opened the door. Rain. Cold, relentless, punishing rain. The kind of rain that doesn't fall so much as a tack, the kind that finds the gap between your collar and your neck and gets in. The kind that had been going for hours and wasn't done yet. Arthur stepped outside. The door closed behind him. He stood on the front step for a moment, suitcase in hand, and looked out at the street. The streetlights were blurring in the rain. The road was empty. The cold was the kind that goes into your bones and sets up home there. He started walking. He didn't have a plan. His car was in the repair shop. His phone was at 22% and the screen kept flickering from the damp. The nearest hotel was 3 miles away, which under normal circumstances was a manageable walk. But Arthur had not slept properly in 4 days, and his chest was doing the thing it did now, the tight, squeezing thing that the doctor had told him not to ignore. He kept walking. He made it about half a mile before his legs started shaking. He sat down on a low wall outside a closed shop, suitcase between his feet, rain coming down without mercy, and tried to catch his breath. He thought about Ruth. He thought about the morning Claire was born, the nurse, the arms, the sudden, overwhelming, terrifying certainty that everything he was and everything he had was now for this small, screaming, astonishing person. He thought about braiding hair from a YouTube video. He thought about parent-teacher conferences and school plays and the Italian restaurant with the checked tablecloths and the breadsticks Claire always started on before they'd even ordered. He thought about the last time she'd laughed with him. Really laughed, the way she used to, and tried to remember exactly when that had been, and found he couldn't place it anymore. The rain kept coming. His chest tightened. He sat very still on the wall and tried to breathe and thought, this is not how it was supposed to go. If you're still watching up to now, type, "I'm still here," in the comment section. His name was Marcus Wibb, and he was driving home from a late shift at the hospital where he worked as a porter when his headlights picked out the figure on the wall. An old man, soaking wet, completely still. Marcus pulled over without thinking about it. Hey, you all right?" Arthur turned his head slowly. His face was pale and tight in the way faces get when the body is running low on something essential. "Fine," Arthur said. "Just resting." Marcus looked at the suitcase, looked at the rain, looked at the man. "You need to come with me," he said. It wasn't a question. Arthur wanted to say no. He was a man who had spent 64 years not being a sayai, burden to anyone. But when he tried to stand up, his legs said something different, and Marcus caught him before he made it all the way to vertical. "There we go," Marcus said quietly. "Come on, let's get you warm." Marcus drove him to the hospital, the same hospital Marcus had just left. He walked Arthur through the emergency entrance himself, spoke to the staff himself, waited until Arthur was in a bed with a heated blanket and a nurse taking his blood pressure before he went home to his own family. Arthur never got his name, not properly. He only found it out later from the staff. The doctors worked through the night. The chest pains were not nothing. There was a blockage, not catastrophic, not yet, but significant. They stabilized him. They talked to him at 7 in the morning with careful faces and precise language and told him he was very lucky he had come in when he did. He thought about that. Lucky. He thought about who had been there to make sure he was lucky. Inside the warm house, with its open-plan kitchen and its expensive furnishings and its aggressive central heating, Claire Mercer lay awake at 2 in the morning, staring at the ceiling. She told herself she'd done the right thing. She told herself it had been necessary. She told herself that Daniel was right, that her father had been a source of tension, that she needed this chapter of her life to work without the weight of the previous one pressing down on it. She told herself these things over and over, the way you do when the alternative to believing them is too large to look at directly. But at 2 in the morning, the defenses come down a little, whether you want them to or not. And into the small, honest hours of the night came the memories. The braided hair, the YouTube video, the way her dad had looked sitting next to her in the front row of her primary school play, still in his work clothes, slightly late because of the shift, absolutely, beaming. The 2-week stretch when she was 15, and she'd been unbearable to live with. She knew she had. She'd been 14 kinds of difficult, and she knew it. And he had not once stopped being patient. Had not once made her feel like she was too much. The phone call the night she got her first real job. She'd called him before she called anyone else. He'd gone quiet for a second, and then he'd said, in a voice that was doing its best to be steady, "Your mum would have been so proud." She pressed her hand over her face. She lay very still and thought, when did I stop being someone who would never do this? She fell asleep eventually, the way you fall asleep when you're exhausted from fighting your own conscience. Not restful, not restorative, just the body demanding what the mind wouldn't grant. In the morning, Daniel made coffee and didn't mention the previous night, and spoke to her with the particular lightness of a man who considers a thing resolved. She went through the morning mechanically, showered, dressed, checked her phone. There was a voicemail from an unknown number. She almost didn't listen to it. She listened to it. It was a nurse. Her father was at St. Catherine's General. He had been admitted overnight. He was stable. They would appreciate a family member making contact. The phone dropped about 6 inches before she caught it. She arrived at the hospital 40 minutes later. She had left without telling Daniel where she was going. She hadn't decided to do that. It had just happened. She had picked up her keys and walked out, and it was only when she was already on the road that she realized she hadn't said a word. She found him in a side room on the second floor. He was sitting up in the bed, the heated blanket still around his shoulders, a cup of tea going cold on the tray beside him. He looked smaller than she remembered. People say that about hospitals, that they make people be smaller, and she had always thought it was a cliché until this moment. He looked up when she came in. Something moved across his face. "You didn't have to come," he said. "Dad." Her voice broke on the single syllable. She sat down in the plastic chair beside his bed and pressed her hand over her eyes, and for a moment couldn't say anything at all. He waited. He was good at waiting. "I'm so sorry," she managed eventually. "I'm so sorry. I can't explain it. I can't justify it. You were frightened," Arthur said quietly. She looked up. "You were frightened of losing something," he said. "And someone told you I was the reason you might lose it." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not angry with you, Claire. I was never angry with you. I was just—" He stopped. "Heartbroken," she said. He nodded. Once. Slowly. She reached out and took his hand. The rough, calloused hand that had worked double shifts and braided her hair and turned pages of dog-eared parenting books and driven 3 hours in a snowstorm. And she held it and didn't say anything for a while. There was no speech that was adequate. She knew that. Some things you can't talk your way out of. You can only sit inside them and feel them fully and decide what you're going to do next. What she decided to do next changed everything. The documents were on Daniel's laptop. She had never gone through his things. She was not by nature a suspicious person. Or she hadn't been. before the past year had slowly, systematically taught her to question her own perceptions until she barely trusted them. But when she got home that afternoon, and Daniel asked where she'd been in the smooth, controlled tone that now finally she could hear for what it was, and she said she'd been at the hospital, and his face did something small and almost imperceptible. Something told her. She waited until he was in the shower. She found the folder quickly. It wasn't even well hidden, which told her something about how confident he had become. Property deeds and names she didn't recognize. A legal letter regarding a civil case in another city. Something about a financial dispute. A woman's name she didn't know. Bank statements for an account she had never been told existed. And photographs, several of them. A woman. Younger than Claire. Messages printed out. The timestamps going back 18 months. 18 months. They had been engaged for 14. She sat on the floor of the study with the documents in her hands and felt the whole architecture of the past 2 years shifting, revealing itself for what it actually was. Not a relationship, a project, a careful, deliberate, methodical project. She thought about what he had said to her. Every word he had used to describe her father. Critical, negative, holding you back, stuck in the past. She thought about all the ways her father had tried to be there, and all the ways she had let herself believe those attempts were something else. She thought about an old man sitting on a wall in the freezing rain with a suitcase. She stood up. She was very calm, the kind of calm that arrives on the other side of something enormous. She called the solicitor. She called the bank. She packed 2 bags. When Daniel came downstairs and found her at the front door, he read her face and his composure cracked just slightly at the edges. "Claire, don't," she said, very quietly. "There is nothing you can say." She left. Arthur came home from the hospital 11 days later. Claire had spent those 11 days making phone calls and signing papers and having conversations she had been avoiding for 2 years. She had also spent them sitting beside her father's bed for several hours a day, sometimes talking, sometimes just being there. They talked about things they hadn't talked about in years. Her mother, the braided hair, the Italian restaurant, the school play he had almost been late for. He told her things about that period, the grief of it, the sheer logistical terror of raising a child alone while his heart was still in pieces, that he had never told her before, because she had been a child and some things you protect children from. She listened to all of it. She was finally old enough to hear it. The Tuesday she brought him home, she had already cleared the spare room at her new flat and put fresh sheets on the bed and bought a copy of the television guide because she remembered he liked to fold down the corners of the pages for the programs he wanted to watch. He stood in the doorway of the spare room and looked at it for a moment. "You didn't have to." "I know." She was standing behind him. "I wanted to." He turned around. His eyes were bright in the way eyes get when something large is happening quietly. "I should have been watching out for you," she said. You spent 31 years watching out for me, and when it mattered, I wasn't." "Stop," he said gently. "We're not doing that. We're going forward." She nodded. "Besides," he said, and something lightened in his face, something that had not been there in a long time. "I believe there's an Italian restaurant we've been neglecting." She laughed. It came out sudden and unguarded, that laugh. The loud one, the one that always caught people off guard. Her mother's laugh. And Arthur Mercer, who had spent 31 years being a father and the past 2 years quietly disappearing from his daughter's life, laughed too. The lesson here is not complicated. It doesn't need to be. There are people in your life who show up not because the circumstances are easy, not because it's convenient, not because they have anything to gain. They show up because they love you in the particular, irreplaceable way that is specific to them, the way that learned your particular version of the world and decided to stay in it. Those people are not obstacles. They are not weights around your ankle. They are not standing between you and your future. They are your future. They are the people who will be sitting in the plastic chair when the other chairs are empty. Hold on to them. Not everyone who offers you warmth is offering you something real. And not everyone who represents the past is trying to keep you there. Sometimes the hardest lesson in life is learning who was always there for you, after you've already pushed them away. And if you're lucky, truly lucky, the kind of lucky that has nothing to do with circumstances and everything to do with grace, you get to learn it in time. Arthur Mercer was that kind of lucky. And so, in the end, was Claire. What would you have done in her place? Do you think she deserved a second chance? Have you ever trusted the wrong person and lost someone important because of it? Let us know in the comments. Your story matters here. And if this video moved you, please give it a like. It helps more people find stories like this one. Subscribe so you never miss what comes next. We'll see you in the next one.